So the day before writing this, I learned that somehow, after the United States, my second biggest audience is in the Philippines, and that has nothing to do with the video, it's just really cool. Mahal ko kayo! Anyway, let's talk about negative status. First, what even is negative status? Well, in Wuthering Waves, negative status refers to a specific kind of debuff applied onto the enemy by certain characters via their kits that are often built around the mechanic. There is a negative status for each element, notably being Spectral Frazzle, Aero Erosion, Havoc Bane, Electro Flare, Glacial Shave, and Fusion Burst, but the last two are currently unused. They each have unique effects, which I'll just explain on screen in case you're not familiar with them. Feel free to pause and read what they do, but most people watching this video should be familiar with the mechanics anyways, so I won't dwell on the basics. In this game, we have 8 characters whose kits feature or revolve around negative status. For Aero Erosion, we have Cardathea and Aero Over. For Spectral Frazzle, we have Zani, Phoebe, and Spectral Over. Shakona can also apply both as well. Lastly, for Havoc Bane, we have Chisa, and for Electro Flare, we have Buling. First of all, I'll say the one thing I like about negative status, and it's that it brings diversification in the Wu meta. We have tools to play around that aren't just dealing as much crit damage as possible, and I think that's great. Through mechanics like Echo Skills, Tune Break, and also negative status, Wu creates unique synergies, interactions, and most importantly playstyles that don't make the meta linear for every character in the game, and that's great. I really like that a lot of characters feel like unique standouts in the way they play, and I appreciate Kuro's efforts to keep on diversifying the ways to play the game that are offered to players. However, I do have many problems with the way negative status is handled, and of course, I don't think I need to say this, but I will just in case. This is all personal opinion, you don't have to agree, and don't go attacking anyone who agrees with this video just because you don't, thank you. However, feel free to tell me in the comments why you don't agree, this video is meant to create constructive discussion after all. So, most importantly, and this refers to the point I said earlier, characters don't feel like their kit is centered around negative status. It's a requirement to create certain synergies and not a unique playstyle. Do Zani and Cardathea really play that differently from other DPS to you? Or does their kit boil down to preparing a resource, using your ultimate to enter in hand state, doing big nukes, and swapping out when you're done? Well, that sounds a lot like Galbrenna, Augusta, and Carlotta to me, yet none of them have anything to do with negative status, so what's different? Like, I listed 8 characters who interact with or apply negative status just a minute ago, but do you remember all of them off the top of your head? Now, don't get me wrong, if you can't remember all of them, that may just be because your memory is as good as mine, but it's also, at least partially, because the characters' kits don't have negative status as the core element of their gameplay. Fundamentally, like I said earlier, characters like Zani and Cardathea feel like they play similarly to other characters instead of falling into a completely new archetype like for example Falova, who doesn't have any energy and needs to build up her ultimate so she can deal damage both on and off field, and that's based on the combos you choose to perform in her active rotation. Isn't that so unique and cool in comparison? With that being said, why exactly do Zani and Cardathea feel that way? Well, the reason's pretty simple. They use negative status not as a means to change their gameplay, but as a means to get extra buffs. Zani immediately converts all Spectral Frazzle applied into her own debuff, Heliacal Amber, which isn't even negative status by the way, which then generates a bar, which she then consumes to enhance her attack's damage. Less Spectral Frazzle applied means less bar generation, so less powerful attacks. And even though her attacks count as Spectral Frazzle damage, you're not dealing damage through Spectral Frazzle as a mechanic. You're just allowing Phoebe to double your damage just by literally existing. Cardathea is similar, but not exactly the same, in the sense that she gets extra damage bonus on her rotation in Fleur-de-Lis form, and damage amplification on her Fleur-de-Lis ultimate, depending on how much Aero Erosion is on the enemies. But again, Aero Erosion isn't the core of the gameplay here, it's just a means to an end to create synergies with extremely specific, limited characters. And here, we branch into another point, which is why a lot of people who do criticize negative status are complaining in the first place. It would be acceptable if negative status didn't bring anything too new to the table. It would just be akin to a different damage type, like echo scale damage with Galbrunna, for example. However, in the case of negative status specifically, it's currently only used as a means to create exclusive synergies with characters who can apply negative status. The two most notorious main DPS who use negative status right now are Zani and Codithea, who I keep mentioning throughout this video, but they're the focus of it. And they have two appliers that they non-negotiably need for their kit to be fully functional, Phoebe and Shakona, respectively. They're limited 5 stars, they have insane buffs specifically tailored to the characters they're intended to play with, and they're completely separated from the rest of the WoW meta. By that, I mean Confession Phoebe won't interact with anybody else in the entire game except Zani, because she provides no buffs that aren't tied to Spectrofrazzle, something Zani is the only one capable of exploiting. And speaking of Zani, she only works anywhere near her full potential with Phoebe, because she was balanced around her existence, and Confession Phoebe provides buffs that are absolutely broken for her. So without, she feels so much less powerful, and that's because she is. On the other hand, Shakona can branch out to other era teams, and even has Spectrofrazzle application available as a secondary option, even though she's primarily intended to work with era erosion. So I think Shakona already resembles what I want out of a negative status support, way more than Confession Phoebe at least. She's not OP outside of era erosion teams, but she's an option, and I think that's worth some points in my book. But like I said earlier, it doesn't apply in reverse. Codithea, who is intended to play with Shakona as her dedicated support, won't fully play into her kit without Shakona involved, unless you have a substantial amount of sequence nodes, which is at least S2 and ideally S3. So in that sense, she also feels like she doesn't belong with the rest of the WoW meta. Lastly, DPS Phoebe is somewhat acceptable, but only somewhat, and with her, we're rounding out all available negative status DPS already. The reason why she's only somewhat acceptable is because all that she cares about is having Spectrofrazzle currently active on the enemy. Any Frazzle applier can do, and for that we have a free option in the form of Spectre Rover, who's still unmatched for her, and in fairness that's pretty good, unlike Zani and Codithea, who when played without their intended limited partners, have a much worse gameplay feel. Plus, Shakona's Frazzle mode exists as an alternative for multi-wave content in DPS Phoebe teams. Here, we definitely feel the need for Spectrofrazzle a little more, but it's still imperfect because multi-wave Frazzle application is only doable by Shakona, and when multi-wave is the focus of one of the most important endgames in WoW, we can't just ignore it when it comes to kit design. Besides, DPS Phoebe was already done once, and cloning her kit for every future negative status character just because she feels like a true negative status DPS isn't feasible because it would be boring as it would be recycled gameplay. Not to mention, Rover is only usable once, and while they're accessed for free, you can't use Spectre Rover for your Phoebe or Zani and have Air Rover available for your Codithea, which Rover getting stretched too thin is a whole other can of worms I may open in another video, but it's still part of the problem. Lastly, when we incorporate negative status in other characters, like Chisa and Buling, again, we run into the issue of negative status being there for, well, we don't even know why it's there. In the case of Chisa, it's for some general defense shred, but she could have that as one of her kit buffs, for example in her passives, and she would feel no different. Similarly for Buling, Electro Flare only gives her a very minor boost to personal damage, which could just be given by increasing her base damage multipliers. So there you have it. My main gripes with negative status are that first, it's too separate from the rest of the WoW meta, where it genuinely feels like there's a general WoW meta with everybody thrown in there, and then there's a negative status meta with characters who only interact with and impact each other. Again, this isn't completely true in the case of characters like Shakona, but I take issue with the fact that we're tossing half her kit design out the window in that case. This creates over-dependencies on owning certain negative status characters together, who feel like they come as a package deal instead of individualized units like Augusta and Yuno, for example. Second, the characters who play around negative status don't feel any different gameplay-wise from a lot of other characters in the game who have nothing to do with the mechanic. It doesn't feel like you're playing a character whose kit revolves around playing on the negative status they're associated with. It just feels like it's a glorified and extremely exclusive buff. And third and finally, negative status inherently has problems in multi-wave content, which is not suitable for a lot of the game's meta, particularly Wuthering Wastes. And even when we do try to make characters who have a useful kit beyond negative status, well, it feels like they aren't even a negative status character in the first place. Now, all of these complaints you may consider valid or invalid, it's up to personal opinion. But when I complain about something, unlike the average Twitter user, it's because I care about it and want to see it improve. I think negative status is a really cool concept that has a lot of potential to create a new, unique, and rewarding gameplay feel if done properly. So how would I go about fixing the problems I mentioned earlier? Well, first of all, let's try to think of a way to fix the overdependency on specific teammates. The solution is honestly super simple. Make characters who can apply and interact with negative status all on their own. Having intended limited partners is fine, they just need to not make the character go from nigh unusable to acceptable. For example, let's create a hypothetical glacial-shaped DPS character. That character could both apply and use the mechanic to their advantage, while their limited partner would only increase the extent of which the glacial-shaped DPS gets to use the mechanic. It wouldn't be necessary to add them for the character to function, but it would be a good increase. Additionally, if we still want to create characters who don't apply their own negative status, but still interact with the mechanic, then please create accessible alternatives. And don't make that alternative yet another form of Rover, because Rover is already getting stretched too thin since you can only use one in endgame. Hence, either buff the old 4-star characters directly, like it was done with Spectre Rover, to give them a new use with the newer characters by applying the negative status they need, or create more new 4-stars like Booling who can apply Electro Flare, but ideally make someone actually able to use that Electro Flare to go along with it. 4-stars are an integral part of the game, and they're not intended to outclass 5-stars. They're intended to provide accessible alternatives. The rate at which we've been getting new 4-stars since version 1.4 is abysmally slow. We only got one 4-star in the entirety of 2025, and this could bring a breath of fresh air to the table if done correctly. However, if we want to adopt that solution, then please don't make the limited 5-star excessively broken compared to the accessible 4-star. We've already seen that with Phoebe and Spectre Rover in relation to Zani, and we don't need that happening again. The 5-star limited option should provide a good increase compared to the 4-star accessible one. I'm not saying to do the opposite, but we do need a more reasonable level of increase instead of a completely earth-shattering one. Second, let's discuss the problem with multi-wave. I have multiple solutions here. My first solution is to give more characters periodic negative status application throughout their rotation, instead of a ton of stacks being applied by a single ability. Shakona is a great example of this, but she's the only one in the game who's capable of that. More, if not most, future negative status characters need to have that periodic application throughout their rotation to be viable in all endgame contents. My second solution is to make it so that characters have two modes of operation. One relies on negative status, the other relies on some other mechanic, like for example echo skills or shields. That way, one character can play into multiple archetypes, one being more suited for high single target damage, and the other more suited for multi-wave damage, and you can make them switch freely in between enemy encounters, like Linnea's Tune Rupture and Tune Strain mechanic. And to address my final point, being that negative status characters don't feel like they play around the mechanic. This one's the easiest to fix. Make it so that characters deal damage primarily through the negative status. No enemy in the game has an immunity to negative status application, so this won't create issues like other games where debuff resistance is present, like Summoner's War for example. Our hypothetical Glacial-Chave DPS from earlier should be dealing direct Glacial-Chave damage over time, and the goal of their rotation could be applying as many stacks as possible, or apply other buffs via some of their key abilities to increase its damage, like their Forte Circuit or their skill. They could get multiple costs to account for multi-wave as well. To diversify gameplay while still feeling like negative status, making characters like COD Theo who consume their negative status to deal damage immediately via certain abilities is a great idea. That removes the element of negative status dealing damage over time and instead creates big nukes that you could still adapt to multi-wave by making it so they get several nukes in their rotation, unlike characters like Jinshi who only get one per rotation. It's also possible, later down the line, to re-explore the concept created by DPS Phoebe, where having a negative status active on the enemy significantly increases damage dealt by attacks in their own kit. This would throw the concept of direct negative status damage out the window, but the character would still feel like a negative status character. In a similar train of thought, it's completely possible to re-explore Zani's concept and make characters who convert a certain negative status into some unique debuff, or otherwise make characters who gain access to special attacks based on how many stacks of a certain negative status are applied on the enemy. You could even make that character synergize with multiple negative statuses by giving them different enhanced attacks based on what kind of negative status is on the enemy. Overall, the possibilities are limitless, and negative status is an archetype that can be fixed by addressing its key issues first and expanding on gameplay feel second. On the other hand, what do you think? Do any of the solutions I offer sound like a potential fix for negative status? Or do you have any other concepts to bring to the table? Let me know in the comments down below. That'll be it for this video. Like, comment, subscribe, and literally 93% of you are unsubscribed. Like, what are you doing? Subscribe immediately to feel special.